In the winter of 1955, a tired seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama refused to give up her seat on a bus. She had no army, no political office, no money, no coordinated plan. Within 381 days, she had broken a system that had survived for a century and ignited a movement that would rewrite the laws of the most powerful nation on earth. This is not a story about resources. It is a story about what happens when ordinary people decide that enough is enough. History is mostly taught as the story of the powerful, the kings who conquered, the generals who won, the emperors who built. But underneath every official history is a second history, the story of people who had none of those things and changed the world anyway. Not through luck, not through accident, through a specific set of moves that, once you see them, you will recognize everywhere. Today, we are going inside 6 moments in history when ordinary people, with no formal power, no wealth, and no guaranteed outcome, broke systems that looked permanent. By the end, you will understand not just what they did, but exactly how they did it, and why it matters right now. The world before, what no power actually means. Before we can understand what these people did, we have to understand what they were facing. Powerlessness in a structured society is not simply the absence of money or weapons. It is something more total. It is when the law does not protect you. When the institutions designed to hear your grievances were built by the same people who benefit from ignoring them. When even the language used to describe your situation has been shaped by those who control it. This was the world Rosa Parks woke up in every morning. It was the world Gandhi inherited when he returned to India. It was the world every person in this video was born into. The systems they were up against were not simply unfair. They were self-reinforcing. Every mechanism designed to produce change had been captured by the people. Change would threaten the ordinary assumption, shared by almost everyone, including most of the people inside these movements, was that nothing fundamental would shift in their lifetimes. The triggering event, the moment someone decided to stop waiting. Here's what the history books almost always get wrong about how change begins. They make it look like a movement caused an event. In reality, an event caused a movement, and the event itself was usually not planned. Rosa Parks did not sit down on that bus as part of a coordinated strategy. Mohandas Gandhi did not walk to the sea with a blueprint for dismantling the British Empire. The students who sat at the Woolworths lunch counter in Greensboro in 1960 did not know that 4 young men refusing to leave their seats would produce sit-ins across 55 cities. Within 2 months, what they shared was not a plan. It was a decision, private, interior, made alone, that the cost of action had finally dropped below the cost of continued inaction. That threshold is different for every person, but every movement in history can be traced back to the moment when enough individuals crossed it simultaneously. Not because they coordinated, but because the conditions had made it unbearable not to. The trigger is never the first match. It is the moment the room is finally full of gas. Early momentum, when nothing becomes something. The first paradox of every movement built without power is that its greatest early strength is the thing its opponents dismiss most completely. Numbers. Not organized numbers, not disciplined numbers. Simply the raw arithmetic of people who share a grievance and have begun to believe, for the first time, that something might actually change. The Montgomery bus boycott worked because 40,000 Black residents of Montgomery, Alabama walked, carpooled, and rode mules to work for 381 days. The city's bus system lost 65% of its revenue. The economic logic was inescapable. And it had been assembled, not through formal organizing, but through a community that already knew how to talk to itself. Through churches, through barbershops, through the daily networks that power never bothers to map because they look like nothing. This is the pattern. Movements without conventional Resources survive their early phase by operating through infrastructure that already exists, social, cultural, religious, and that the opposition has never thought to suppress because it never seemed dangerous. The early momentum of every movement in this video came not from strength, but from the profound underestimation of the people. Who held power? Hidden weaknesses, what the system could not see. Every system that looked permanent had the same hidden weakness. It needed the cooperation of the people it was oppressing to function. This sounds obvious in retrospect. It was not obvious at the time. The British Empire needed Indian administrators, Indian soldiers, Indian tax collectors, and Indian consumers to operate. It could not run its empire with British personnel alone. There was simply not enough of them. When Gandhi understood this, the entire strategic logic of the independence movement shifted. You do not fight the empire. You withdraw from it. You stop buying its cloth, stop using its courts, stop staffing its offices, and the empire, which appeared to be a military and political structure, reveals itself to be an economic one, entirely dependent on the participation of the people it claims to rule. The same vulnerability existed in Montgomery. The bus system needed Black passengers to be financially viable. It needed Black workers to operate the broader economy of the city. The moment that dependency was weaponized, turned from invisible cooperation into deliberate withdrawal, the system's hidden architecture became visible to everyone. The oppressor's greatest weakness was always the oppressed person's labor, their money, their compliance. They had simply never been shown how to stop giving it. The pressure builds when the system fights back. Power does not yield quietly. Every movement in this video reached a point where the system it was challenging responded with the only tools it knew: force, suppression, and the threat of consequences. And in almost every case, that response made the movement stronger. When Birmingham's Public Safety Commissioner, Bull Connor, turned fire hoses and police dogs on peaceful Black protesters in 1963, he believed he was ending the movement. Instead, the images traveled around the world within 24 hours. They appeared on the front pages of newspapers in London, Paris, and Tokyo. They reached the desk of President John F. Kennedy, who had been carefully avoiding the civil rights issue for 2 years. Connor did not understand that he was not simply suppressing a protest. He was performing live for a global audience. The exact moral contradiction that the movement had been trying to expose. The same pattern repeated in India. Every time the British arrested Gandhi, they transformed a lawyer into a martyr, and a martyr into a symbol. The Amritsar Massacre of 1919, in which British troops killed hundreds of unarmed Indian civilians, did not end the independence movement. It ended any remaining moral legitimacy the British had for being in India at all. Repression, applied against a movement that has learned to use it, is gasoline. The turning point, the moment the impossible became inevitable. There is a moment in every successful movement when the question changes. It stops being "can this succeed?" and becomes "when will it succeed?" That shift, invisible to historians, sometimes invisible even to the people inside the movement, is the real turning point. It is not a military victory. It is not a law passed. It is a change in what enough people believe is possible. For the American Civil Rights Movement, that moment came not in Washington but in Selma, Alabama, on March 7, 1965, Bloody Sunday, when state troopers attacked 600 peaceful marchers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and the footage aired on national television that evening, interrupting a broadcast of judgment at Nuremberg. Something cracked, not in the protesters, in the audience. Millions of white Americans who had considered the civil rights debate a distant Southern problem watched on their own televisions, in their own living rooms, an image indistinguishable from the newsreels of Nazi Germany. They were already watching that night. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. Within days, President Johnson addressed Congress and used, for the first time, the words of the movement itself We shall overcome. The Voting Rights Act passed 5 months later. The turning point was never about power. It was about perception. The moment the story the system was telling about itself became impossible to maintain. Once that story breaks, the system has already lost. Everything that follows is simply the formal acknowledgement of what the turning point already decided. The collapse accelerates when the unthinkable becomes normal. On February 11, 1990, Nelson Mandela walked out of Victor Verster prison after 27 years of captivity. 4 years later, he was president of South Africa, a system of racial oppression that had governed every aspect of life for decades that had seemed, to most of the world, including most South Africans, structurally permanent, had collapsed inside a single decade. This is not unusual. It is the rule. The Soviet Union, which had survived for 74 years and controlled one of the largest military arsenals in human history, dissolved in less than 2 years once the perception of its permanence broke. The British Empire, which had taken centuries to build, lost the majority of its territories inside a single generation after Indian independence in 1947 demonstrated that departure was survivable. The speed of collapse consistently shocks observers because they have fundamentally misunderstood what was holding the structure together. It was not force. Force was expensive and finite. It was the belief, shared by both the powerful and the powerless, that the arrangement was permanent. Once that belief fails, there is nothing underneath it. The structure does not weaken gradually. It falls. The other side, what they did that actually worked. Strip away the mythology, and every successful movement in this video operated on the same 3 principles. First, they made the cost of oppression higher than the cost of reform. This is the iron logic underneath the Montgomery boycott, the Salt March, the sit-ins, the solidarity strikes in Poland. They did not ask for justice. They made injustice economically, politically, and reputationally expensive until the calculus of the opposition changed. Second, they kept the moral high ground as a strategic asset, not just an ethical one. Every movement in this video trained its members, with extraordinary discipline, to absorb violence without returning it, not because they were passive, but because they understood that the moment the movement became violent, the story changed. The oppressor becomes the victim. The audience goes home. Third, they built parallel institutions that could outlast any single moment of confrontation. The Montgomery Improvement Association, the Indian National Congress, the underground solidarity networks in Poland. They were not just protests. They were governments in waiting, structures capable of filling the vacuum that power leaves when it falls. Movements that lack any one of these 3 elements tend to fail. Movements that have all 3 tend to win. The final act. What changed and what didn't? Here's the part of the story that the inspirational version leaves out. Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat. The boycott succeeded. The Supreme Court ruled segregation on public buses unconstitutional. And then, in the 60 years that followed, the racial wealth gap in the United States barely moved. Legal victory and structural transformation are not the same thing. The British left India in 1947, and they left behind borders drawn into 6 weeks by a man who had never been to the subcontinent, dividing communities that had coexisted for centuries, producing a partition that killed between 200,000 and 2 million people. Depending on which historian you read, liberation and justice are not the same thing. This is not a reason for despair. It is a reason for clarity. Every movement in this video achieved something real and left something unfinished. The ones that understood the difference between winning a battle and winning a war were the ones that built durable institutions rather than celebrating a moment. The ones that confused the 2 that believed. The first victory was the final one, left vacuums that new concentrations of power rushed to fill. Change without institution is not transformation. It is rotation. Verdict: what no power actually means. So how did they do it? How did people with no army, no money, and no plan change the world? The answer is in 3 parts. First, they were never actually powerless. They had been told they were, and they had, for a time, believed it. But every person in every movement in this video was sitting on a form of power that the system depended on and had never thought to take seriously. Their labor, their compliance, their money, their bodies in public space. The first move was always the same: recognizing that dependency and deciding to make it visible. Second, they did not need to defeat power. They needed to make it expensive. Force is not beaten by equal force. It is beaten by making the cost of its continued use higher than the cost of negotiation. Every successful movement in this video found the point where the price of repression exceeded the price of reform and applied pressure. Precisely there. Third, and most importantly, they changed what people believed was possible. This is the move that all the others depend on. Systems do not fall when they are attacked. They fall when enough people, including the people inside them, stop believing they are permanent. That is what Rosa Parks did on that bus. She did not attack the system. She stopped confirming it. And in that single act of refusal, she demonstrated something that cannot be unsaid: that the most powerful force in any society is not the army, or the law, or the money. It is the story people are willing to keep telling about why things have to be this way. Change the story. Change everything. Closing: the movements that failed were just as committed as the ones that succeeded. Next, we go inside the ones that fell apart, and the single decision that made the difference. Subscribe and stay close. That story is coming.